New York, October 1907. The city is on edge. Rumors are flying. Depositors rush to pull their money from the trust companies. Crowds spill onto Broad Street, clustering in front of Knickerbocker Trust, one of the largest financial institutions in the city. Whispers ripple through the crowd. The bank is insolvent. Inside the private library of financier J.P. Morgan, a different crowd gathers, smaller but no less afraid. These are the titans of Wall Street, the men who control the lifeblood of American finance. They've been summoned to Morgan's study as the markets threaten to collapse. Morgan's thick cigars fill the air as he forces bankers and trust company heads to pledge cash, to shore up one another, to stop the panic from spreading. But here's what few people realize. The person in New York with the most cash on hand that week isn't Morgan. It isn't a railroad baron or a trust company president. It's a woman. Her name is Hetty Green. She arrives not in jewels and silks, but in a plain black Quaker dress. No entourage, no airs, just steely confidence and liquid capital. She is, by some accounts, the only woman invited into the inner meetings at the Morgan Library that fall. And she isn't there to ask for help. She's there because she doesn't panic. She has money when no one else does. In the weeks before the crash, Hetty quietly warned friends to pull funds from shaky institutions, including Knickerbocker Trust itself, before it went under. While other financiers scrambled to sell off assets, Hetty had already raised cash. She had anticipated the storm. When the city of New York faced bankruptcy during the crisis, it was Hetty Green, not just J.P. Morgan, who stepped in. She loaned the city over $1 million. And earlier that same year, several millions more. She demanded collateral, of course, but she didn't gouge the city with ruinous terms. She was steady. In a moment when even great fortunes evaporated, Hetty's liquidity gave her unmatched leverage. The press would later sneer at her, calling her the Witch of Wall Street, a miser, a recluse, a woman out of place. Henrietta Howland Robinson was born in 1834 in New Bedford, Massachusetts. A world of wailing fortunes and Quaker simplicity. Her family, the Howlands, were among the city's wealthiest. Her father, Edward Mott Robinson, made his fortune by outfitting and owning whaling ships, supplying them, financing them, and reaping the profits when they returned laden with oil and bone. New Bedford, in the mid-19th century, was booming. Its harbor crowded with ships that sailed to the farthest seas. But alongside this prosperity was the Quaker ethic of restraint. Displays of wealth were frowned upon. Plain dress, plain speech, plain living. These were the values Hetty absorbed from childhood. She was not the sort of girl who played with dolls or dreamt of dances. Her childhood revolved around ledgers and letters. Her grandfather, Gideon Howland, was nearly blind, and it fell to young Hetty to read him the daily financial reports. She studied the market tables in the newspaper, memorized them, repeated them aloud. Later, she would say this exercise trained her mind. Numbers, bonds, prices. These became her language when most children were still learning their alphabet. Her parents noticed. When other girls were being schooled in embroidery or piano, Hetty was encouraged to study commerce. By 13, she was managing parts of the family's household accounts. At 15, she was sent to a finishing school in Boston. But it wasn't the kind of education she wanted. She complained of boredom, of frivolity. She wanted numbers, not dances. Her father was a hard man, a sharp businessman, and he saw in Hetty someone who shared his instinct for thrift and his suspicion of extravagance. He let her sit in on business meetings. He introduced her to traders. He taught her to read a balance sheet. For a young woman in the 1840s, this was extraordinary. In 1865, when both her father and her wealthy Aunt Sylvia died, Hetty inherited a combined fortune worth around $7 million, one of the largest inheritances ever received by an American woman. But even that moment was not simple. Hetty believed her aunt's estate should pass entirely to her. She presented a so-called deathbed will in her favor. The case went to court. Handwriting experts testified, and in 1871, the will was declared a forgery. The judge ruled against her. Hetty lost what could have been an even larger slice of the Howland fortune. The scandal gave ammunition to her critics, but Hetty pressed forward. Even without the disputed millions, she was independently wealthy. And unlike other heiresses of the Gilded Age, she did not retreat into the safety of a trust company or hand her fortune to male relatives. She did something very different. She took her money and walked directly into the financial centers of New York, determined to manage every dollar herself. That choice was radical. Women of her time were not expected to handle investments, let alone compete with men in banking or railroads. The world of finance was exclusive, male, and merciless. Yet Hetty entered it with confidence, armed with the habits she had learned from her grandfather's ledgers and her father's cautious strategies. She believed thrift was power, knowledge was protection, and independence was the only safeguard for a woman's fortune. When Hetty Robinson came into her inheritance in the 1860s, she did not do what most women of her class were expected to do. She didn't hire a trustee to manage her fortune. She didn't retreat into a brownstone, spending her days hosting teas or purchasing silks. Instead, she carried her ledgers to New York City and took up residence in modest boarding houses, sometimes in Brooklyn, sometimes near Wall Street itself, so she could be close to the center of finance. The financial world of the Gilded Age was a carnival of speculation. Men made and lost fortunes overnight in railroads, land booms, and stocks bought on margin. Hetty wanted no part of it. She studied securities with the same careful scrutiny she had used as a girl reading bond tables for her grandfather. She examined railroad charters, checked balance sheets, questioned valuations. If she didn't understand a deal, she walked away. "I never speculate," she said later, and she meant it. What she did instead was practice what we would today call value investing, buying assets worth more than their current price, but only when there was a clear margin of safety. She also kept large reserves of cash, even when it earned no interest. This gave her flexibility when panic struck. She preferred safe bonds and first mortgages, purchased at a discount when sellers were desperate. She believed in what she called a margin of safety, buying well below what she thought something was truly worth. So even if her calculations were off, she would not lose. Her frugality was part of this philosophy. Living simply allowed her to keep more money free, ready to act when others had none. She was skeptical of debt. She avoided leverage almost completely. At a time when many fortunes were built on borrowed money, Hetty's was anchored in her refusal to owe. She believed borrowing clouded judgment, forcing investors to act rashly to cover interest and margin calls. By avoiding it, she bought herself patience. This approach made her unusual not only as a woman, but as an investor of any kind. She was uninterested in appearances, in high-risk bets, in following the crowd. And when panics came, as they often did in the late 19th century, her patience paid off. In 1873, when banks suspended payments, Hetty had cash. In 1884, when her own husband collapsed financially, she remained secure. And in 1893, during one of the worst depressions in American history, she emerged once again as a lender, not a borrower. What most impressed her contemporaries was her independence. A young woman with a fortune, operating on her own, moving through Wall Street offices filled almost exclusively with men. She carried herself with composure. She never sought their approval, only their collateral. Her plain black dress made her stand out, as much as the millions she managed. In 1867, Hetty married Edward Henry Green, a Vermont businessman. Their union was unusual from the start. Hetty insisted on a prenuptial agreement, a rarity for the time, to ensure her fortune remained entirely under her control. She had seen too many women lose everything to reckless husbands, and she refused to take that risk. Edward was tall, charming, and fond of the good life. He enjoyed clubs, cigars, speculation. Hetty, by contrast, preferred ledgers, bonds, and cash. At first, the marriage was workable. They had 2 children, Ned and Sylvia, and divided their time between New York and Edward's Vermont estate. But when Edward speculated heavily in railroad stocks, things began to unravel. In the panic of 1884, his fortunes collapsed. He had borrowed on margin and could not meet his obligations. The banks came calling, and Hetty, with her usual caution, was drawn in. One of her husband's loans had been guaranteed in part with her assets. She found herself fighting bankers in court to protect what was hers. The episode left her furious. Though she never divorced Edward, the couple effectively separated. He lived in Vermont, while Hetty moved with her children into modest lodgings in New York, sometimes even staying in boarding houses. Reporters followed her, fascinated by this woman who shunned society and lived plainly despite her enormous fortune. It was during these years that the press began calling her the Witch of Wall Street. The label reflected both misogyny and resentment. She did not dress fashionably. She did not flatter men in power. She did not spend freely. To Gilded Age reporters, a woman who controlled her money so fiercely had to be a witch. Hetty, for her part, ignored the sneers. She continued to lend money on her terms, to railroads, businesses, even to municipalities. Her thrift became legendary, though it was often exaggerated into caricature. She rode in streetcars rather than carriages. She wore the same black dress, patched and worn. She carried her lunch in a paper bag. These habits made her easy to mock, but they also kept her liquid, ready to pounce when opportunity came. By the end of the 1880s, Hetty Green was no longer simply an heiress who managed her own money. She was a fixture of Wall Street, a woman whose loans and investments could move markets. And though her husband's ruin had been a bitter lesson, it reinforced what she already knew. Independence was her greatest safeguard. By the 1890s, Hetty Green was no longer just a wealthy woman. She was a headline. Her fortune and her frugality had made her notorious, and the press found in her a perfect subject, eccentric, female, and rich beyond measure. They gave her a name, the Witch of Wall Street. The label stuck. It colored nearly every story written about her. Newspapers ran caricatures of Hetty in a dour black dress, her nose sharp, her eyes narrowed, clutching a bag of money like a miser in a fable. They claimed she pinched pennies until they screamed, that she refused to heat her home in winter, that she scolded her son Ned for wanting medical treatment for his injured leg. The stories became legend, and the legend became her image. But when you step behind the headlines, the picture shifts. Many of these tales were exaggerations, half-truths, or outright inventions designed to sell papers. Hetty did live simply. That much was true. She preferred boarding houses. She carried her lunch in paper wrappings. But it wasn't because she had no money. It was because she believed luxury was a trap. To her, every dollar spent on display was a dollar that could not be invested, could not be used in a panic, could not protect her family's independence. Even the infamous story of Ned's leg, repeated endlessly in newspapers, is more complicated than the myth. Some papers claimed that Hetty's refusal to pay for a doctor cost her son his limb. In reality, Ned did receive treatment, though not always from the most fashionable physicians. Later in life, he defended his mother, insisting she had been unfairly vilified. But by then, the narrative had hardened. The miserly witch was too good a story to abandon. And yet, the record shows something different. Hetty's frugality was a strategy, not a compulsion. She kept cash available so that when panic struck, she could lend. And lend she did. In 1907, as banks froze and businesses collapsed, Hetty extended millions in loans, sometimes at below-market rates, because she believed stability was better than profiteering. Cities, railroads, and companies turned to her when banks would not. She also gave quietly to charities, though she avoided publicity. Her son recalled that she disliked being seen as a benefactor, fearing it would invite endless requests. She preferred anonymity, helping individuals directly rather than endowing institutions that would put her name on a plaque. But anonymous charity didn't sell newspapers. What sold were tales of a miser who hoarded pennies while sitting atop millions, and the gendered element of her reputation is impossible to miss. Male financiers who dressed plainly or lived modestly were praised for discipline when J.P. Morgan growled at bankers or Cornelius Vanderbilt pinched costs. It was called toughness. When Hetty Green did the same, it was called witchcraft. She was an outsider not only because she was a woman, but because she refused to play the game of social performance that defined Gilded Age elites. On July 3, 1916, Hetty Green died in New York City at the age of 81. The newspapers that had mocked her in life now printed her obituaries in bold type, and the numbers spoke for themselves. Her estate was valued at around $100 million, a staggering sum at the time, and by many accounts, the largest fortune ever accumulated by a woman in America. For all the sensational headlines, she had accomplished what few of her era achieved. She preserved and grew her wealth across half a century marked by volatility, panics, depressions. She had outlasted the railroad booms and busts, the wild stock speculation, the banking collapses, even the ridicule of her peers. While the Witch of Wall Street moniker clung to her in print, the Ledger told a different story. A disciplined, cautious, and remarkably consistent investor. Her fortune passed to her two children, Ned and Sylvia. They lived very differently than their mother. Ned, despite the stories of his injured leg, became a lively figure, a yachtsman, a generous spender. Sylvia lived in greater comfort as well. In time, much of the Green fortune filtered into philanthropy through charitable donations, foundations, and public bequests. Ironically, the woman who avoided public charity during her life ended up financing it through her heirs. But Hetty's true legacy is not in the dollar amount she left behind. It is in the method. She was practicing principles decades before they had names. The importance of liquidity, the margin of safety, the discipline of avoiding leverage, the value of independence. When Benjamin Graham later codified the philosophy of value investing in the 1930s, he echoed ideas Hetty had already lived. There is also a cultural legacy to acknowledge. Hetty Green revealed how gender shaped reputation in finance. Her thrift was called stinginess, her independence called coldness, her simplicity called eccentricity. The very traits admired in male financiers were treated as flaws in her. Yet, despite the ridicule, she persisted. She made no apologies for her discipline. She never ceded her financial autonomy. In doing so, she became a pioneer, not only in investing, but in the broader struggle for women's independence in economic life. Today, more than a century after her death, the nickname Witch of Wall Street still lingers. It is catchy, but misleading. What her story really shows is not witchcraft, but willpower. Not spells, but strategy. She knew what she believed, and she stuck to it through decades of turbulence. In an age when fortunes were lost as quickly as they were made, hers endured. So what can we learn from the so-called Witch of Wall Street? Hetty Green's life was not about spells or secrecy. It was about discipline. And the habits she practiced in the late 1800s still apply today. First, liquidity is a strategy, not a feeling. Hetty always raised cash before storms. That cash was not idle. It was ammunition. In 1907, while banks froze, she had the liquidity to lend to New York City itself. For modern investors, the principle is the same. Cash gives you choice. In a panic, choice is everything. Second, always keep a margin of safety. Hetty bought assets only when she could get them below their real worth. If she thought a bond was worth 100, she would not pay 99. She would wait for 80. That margin protected her if she miscalculated or if conditions worsened. It is the same principle that later defined value investing. Leave yourself room for error. Third, avoid leverage creep. Hetty despised debt. She watched her husband Edward lose everything in 1884 because he borrowed too much. She refused to make the same mistake. Without leverage, she could ride out downturns instead of being forced to sell. For us, the lesson is clear. Debt magnifies both gains and losses, and it's often the losses that last. Fourth, in crises, calm lenders win. When panics came, Hetty was not a victim. She was a creditor. She lent against collateral others overlooked: real estate, rail rights, bonds sold at discount. She didn't exploit with outrageous terms. She lent steadily, with security, and was repaid. For anyone with capital, there is power in being calm when others are desperate. Fifth, costs and simplicity create optionality. Her plain dress and modest boarding houses were not about misery. They were about keeping her fortune liquid. Every dollar she didn't waste on luxuries was a dollar that stayed ready for opportunity. In modern terms, keep expenses lean, avoid lifestyle inflation, and give yourself the flexibility to act when chances come. And sixth, protect the entity. Hetty's early prenuptial agreement was groundbreaking. It kept her fortune separate, safe from her husband's creditors, and under her own control. She documented her deals carefully. She never let her wealth blur into someone else's liabilities. For us, that means protecting assets with clear structures, contracts, trusts, documentation. Independence is not only a personal stance, it is a legal one. Taken together, these are not the tricks of a miser or the curses of a witch. They are the principles of a disciplined investor who outlasted every crisis of her age. When Hetty Green died in 1916, she left behind not just a fortune of $100 million, but a playbook. A playbook for how to survive panics, preserve capital, and stay independent in a world that rewards conformity. Her story reminds us, wealth is not built in moments of frenzy. It is built in the quiet discipline of patience, in the refusal to be swept along by the crowd, and in the courage to stand apart. That was Hetty Green's true power, and it remains just as powerful today